Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The 21st of December, 1988, a Wednesday, in the gathering darkness of a winter evening, the world hums with the familiar rhythms of the holiday season. In London's Heathrow Airport, Terminal 3 is a river of humanity. Students are heading home for the break, their faces bright with relief and anticipation. Families are reuniting, their embraces tight and heartfelt. Business travelers, weary from a year of work, are making their final journey home before Christmas. The air is filled with the scent of jet fuel and overpriced coffee, the sounds of rolling luggage and announcements echoing through the cavernous hall. It is a scene of utter, reassuring normalcy. Among the travelers are the 243 passengers of Pan Am Flight 103, the Clipper Maid of the Seas, a Boeing 747, one of the majestic queens of the sky, gleaming under the airport lights. For many, this flight is merely a bridge, a 7-hour passage across the Atlantic from the old world to the new. For the 35 students from Syracuse University, it is the triumphant final chapter of a semester abroad, a return to family and home. For the Johansson family, it is a journey to a funeral. For intelligence officers and diplomats, it is simply another commute. For a young couple, it is the start of their honeymoon. Each person carries a story, a destination, a web of connections that spans the globe. The plane takes off a little after 6:30 in the evening, climbing gracefully into the ink-black sky, its lights a receding constellation against the clouds. It ascends to its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet, a silver bullet arcing over the sleeping towns and darkened fields of England, heading northwest towards the Scottish border. On the flight deck, Captain Jim McCary, a veteran pilot, guides the aircraft into the Prestwick Oceanic Area Control Center's airspace. At 7:02, the controller at Prestwick sees Flight 103's transponder signal on his screen, a single, steady green square. He gives them clearance to begin their transatlantic crossing. There is no reply. He tries again. Silence. And then the single green square blossoms into 5, then more, a horrifying, expanding flower of light on the radar screen before it fades into nothing. On the ground below, in the quiet Scottish market town of Lockerbie, residents are settling in for the night. They are wrapping last-minute Christmas presents, watching television, putting their children to bed. The weather is cold, a biting wind whipping through the narrow streets. Just after 7 o'clock, a sound begins, a low, deep rumble that seems to come from the very marrow of the earth. It is not thunder. It is something deeper, more violent, a sound that shakes windows and rattles teacups in their saucers. And then, the sky itself catches fire. An apocalyptic rain begins to fall. Not water, but a deluge of twisted metal, shattered luggage, clothing, Christmas presents, and human beings. A vast section of the 747's fuselage, nearly 90 feet long, crashes into a residential street, Rosebank Crescent. The main wing section, carrying tens of thousands of gallons of jet fuel, plummets into Sherwood Crescent, impacting with the force of a small earthquake. It explodes into a gargantuan fireball that incinerates several houses, carving a crater over 150 feet long, and vaporizing everything and everyone in its path. 11 residents of Lockerbie, going about their quiet evening routines, are extinguished from existence in a fraction of a second. In the moments that follow, a stunned silence gives way to a scene from Dante's Inferno. Fires rage against the blackness of the Scottish night. The smell of aviation fuel is overpowering. Debris is everywhere, embedded in fields, tangled in trees, resting on rooftops. For the people of Lockerbie, the world has ended. They do not yet know the name Pan Am 103. They only know the horror that has fallen from the sky. They do not yet know it was an act of terrorism. They only know that their small, peaceful corner of the world has become the largest crime scene in British history. 270 lives, from 21 different countries, ended in a flash of light over their town. The question that would consume the next decade, and reverberate for decades more, was not just who did this, but how. How do you investigate a murder committed 5 miles up in the air? How do you find a killer's fingerprint when the evidence is scattered across 845 square miles of frigid, wintry landscape? Today, we dissect the anatomy of a global investigation. We will follow the forensic scientists who pieced together an impossible puzzle, the detectives who followed a trail of clues from a Scottish hillside to a tiny shop on a Mediterranean island, and the prosecutors who waged a decade-long battle to bring a ghost to justice. This is the story of how the world sought answers for the dead of Pan Am Flight 103. The initial hours and days in Lockerbie were a tableau of chaos, grief, and heroic resolve. The Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, a small rural police force with just over 200 officers, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of the deadliest terrorist attack on British soil. Their jurisdiction, normally concerned with local disputes and traffic incidents, had transformed overnight into a sprawling, complex, and deeply traumatic international crime scene. The first priority was a grim one: the search for survivors. But as the full scope of the devastation became clear, hope quickly turned to the heart-wrenching task of recovery. Thousands of police officers from across Scotland and the north of England, soldiers, Royal Air Force personnel, and civilian volunteers descended on the area. They formed long, sweeping lines, walking shoulder to shoulder across muddy fields, through dense forests, and over rolling hills. The search area was immense, stretching from the Scottish borders into the north of England. The weather was brutal, with freezing rain and biting winds that numbed fingers and chilled the soul. The task was not just physically grueling, but emotionally shattering. Searchers were confronted with the deeply personal effects of the 270 victims, scattered indiscriminately. A child's teddy bear, a half-written letter, a family photograph, a Christmas gift. These were not just objects. They were the last, silent remnants of lives cut short. Every single piece of debris, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was treated as potential evidence. Each item was flagged with a small colored marker, its location meticulously recorded on a grid map, then bagged, tagged, and transported to a makeshift incident room set up in Lockerbie's town hall. It was the beginning of one of the largest forensic exercises ever undertaken. The scale was staggering. Within weeks, more than 10,000 individual items of debris had been collected. This number would eventually grow into the millions. While the search scoured the countryside, the central hub of the investigation was being established at a disused army base, RAF Longtown, just across the border in England. Here, in a vast cold hangar, a full-scale reconstruction of the Boeing 747 began. A metal framework, an exact outline of the aircraft, was erected. As pieces of the fuselage were brought in, forensic experts from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AAIB, began the painstaking process of reattaching them to the frame. Like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of horrifying complexity, it was slow, methodical work. They washed each piece, analyzed its fractures, and searched for any telltale signs of an explosion. Very quickly, the investigators confirmed what many had suspected from the start. This was not an accident. The wreckage showed clear evidence of a high-performance plastic explosive. The question now was where. Where on the 200-foot-long aircraft had the bomb been placed? The answer lay in the metal itself. An explosion leaves a unique signature on aluminum skin, pitting, petal-like peeling, and severe fragmentation. By examining the pattern and severity of this damage, experts could trace the blast waves back to their point of origin. They focused on a luggage container designated by the code Avenue 4041, which had been recovered in fragments from a field miles from the main wreckage. The damage to this container and the surrounding fuselage was catastrophic. The bomb had been inside a suitcase in this specific container, located in the forward cargo hold, on the left side of the plane, just above the Pan Am logo. They had found their ground zero. Now, the focus of the investigation narrowed intensely. The contents of every bag that could have been in or near container Avenue 4041 were subjected to microscopic examination. Investigators sifted through a mountain of shredded clothing, charred paper, and pulverized personal items. They were hunting for something that might not even exist anymore. The remnants of the bomb itself. The explosive was identified as Semtex, a plastic explosive manufactured in Czechoslovakia, favored by terrorists for its power and stability. But Semtex alone didn't tell them who the bomber was. They needed the trigger. They needed the device that told the bomb when to explode. In a sea of debris, the breakthrough came from the tiniest of fragments. Dr. Thomas Hayes of the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment, or RARDE, was examining a piece of charred nylon from a suitcase. Embedded within the material, he found a fragment of green plastic, no bigger than a fingernail. It was a piece of a circuit board. Under a microscope, he could make out part of a timer track. This was it. This was the heart of the bomb. The fragment was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that in any less thorough investigation, it would have been missed entirely. It was a testament to the sheer methodical grit of the forensic teams. The fragment was sent for further analysis. Experts identified it as belonging to a very specific type of electronic timer, a model known as the MST-13, and this specific model, they discovered, was manufactured by a small Swiss electronics firm named Mebo AG, owned by a man named Edwin Bollier. When investigators from Scotland and the FBI visited Bollier in Switzerland, he confirmed their suspicions. He admitted to designing and selling these timers. And his primary customer, the recipient of a special order of these precise MST-13 timers, was the Libyan military. For the first time, the investigation had a direct physical link, a tangible thread leading from a Scottish field all the way to a rogue state in North Africa. The timer fragment was the key, but it was not the entire lock. To build a criminal case, investigators needed to know how that timer got into a suitcase and onto Pan Am 103. The focus shifted back to the wreckage, specifically to the charred and shredded clothing found near the blast-seeded fragment. Forensic scientists began the arduous task of reconstructing the bomb suitcase itself. They identified fragments of a hard-sided Samsonite suitcase, and within the blast radius, they found the remnants of several items of clothing that had been packed inside it. Among the scorched scraps, they identified pieces of a baby's sleep suit, a man's brown tweed jacket, a blue and white striped shirt, gray trousers, and a distinctive herringbone-patterned shirt. Crucially, they found a label. The items had been purchased from a clothing store in Malta. This was another monumental leap forward. The investigation now had two powerful, independent lines of inquiry, one forensic and one commercial. and both were pointing towards the Mediterranean. The Swiss timer had led them to Libya. Now a collection of charred clothing was leading them to Malta. The team of Scottish detectives and FBI agents that descended on the small island nation of Malta in 1989 had a seemingly impossible task. They had to find the specific shop that sold these generic items of clothing and, hopefully, the person who bought them. They fanned out across the island, visiting countless clothing stores, showing merchants the fragments and photographs. Finally, in the town of Sliema, they found it, a small shop called Mary's House. The owner, a man named Tony Gossi, recognized the items instantly. He remembered selling them. Gossi's memory would become one of the most critical and later, one of the most controversial pillars of the entire case. He told investigators that on a day in either late November or early December of 1988, a man came into his shop to buy an assortment of clothing. Gossi remembered the transaction because the man was an unusual customer. He seemed completely uninterested in the sizes or styles of the clothes he was buying, which struck the shopkeeper as odd. The man was large, he said, and looked Libyan. Crucially, Gossi also remembered that it had started to rain just as the man was leaving, and the man had also purchased an umbrella. This detail about the rain allowed investigators to cross-reference his memory with meteorological records, narrowing the date of the purchase down to either November 23rd or December 7th, 1988. Tony Gossi became the prosecution's star witness. He provided a description of the buyer, and when later shown a photo lineup, he would tentatively identify one of the main Libyan suspects. His testimony was the human link in a chain of otherwise cold forensic evidence. It connected a specific individual to the very clothes that were wrapped around the bomb. However, his evidence was not without problems. Over the course of multiple interviews, his recollection of the man's age and appearance seemed to shift. He was also offered a substantial reward for his cooperation, a fact the defense would later seize upon to challenge his credibility. But for the investigators in the moment, Gossi's testimony was the breakthrough they desperately needed. It placed their suspect on the ground, buying the materials that would be used to commit mass murder. While the Maltese connection was being solidified, another team was working on the complex logistics of the flight itself. They knew the bomb was on Pan Am 103 when it left London. But how did it get there? Pan Am 103 had originated as a feeder flight, PA123A, from Frankfurt, Germany. Passengers and their luggage were transferred at Heathrow. The investigation traced every single piece of checked luggage. They determined that the bomb suitcase was an unaccompanied bag. It had not been checked in by any of the passengers who boarded in Frankfurt or London. This pointed to a sophisticated plot. The suitcase had been introduced into the airline baggage system somewhere else and routed to join the flight. The luggage tags indicated it had come from Air Malta flight KM180, which flew from Lucca Airport in Malta to Frankfurt that same day. In Frankfurt, the bag would have been automatically transferred, along with all the other interline luggage, into the Pan Am system and loaded onto the flight to London, and then finally onto the doomed 747. There was no passenger attached to this bag. It was a ghost, a Trojan horse sent on a one-way journey. The evidence was now forming a coherent, terrifying narrative. A bomb, built around a sophisticated Swiss timer sold to Libya, was placed in a Samsonite suitcase. That suitcase was filled with clothing bought at a specific shop in Malta by a man who appeared to be Libyan. The bag was then placed unaccompanied onto an Air Malta flight to Frankfurt, where it was transferred to the Pan Am system and loaded onto Flight 103, all set to detonate at a specific time, high over the Atlantic Ocean, where the evidence would be lost forever in the depths. The plan was nearly perfect. Its only flaw was that the plane was running slightly behind schedule. The bomb detonated not over the ocean, but over land, leaving its secrets scattered across the Scottish countryside for investigators to find. Now, intelligence agencies around the world began to focus their resources on identifying the specific individuals responsible. The CIA, MI6, and others had long been monitoring Libyan intelligence activities. From their vast pools of data, and with the new forensic evidence in hand, they began to zero in on two men. The first was Abdul Basit al-Megrahi. He was a senior officer in the Jamahiriya el-Mukhabarat, the Libyan intelligence service. More significantly, he was the chief of security for Libyan Arab Airlines. This position gave him unparalleled access to airports and baggage handling systems across Europe and the Middle East, including at Lucca Airport in Malta. He traveled frequently under various aliases and passports. His physical appearance was a close match to the description provided by the Maltese shopkeeper, Tony Gossi. Travel records placed him in Malta on December 20th, the day before the bombing. He was the prime suspect. The second man was Lamin Khalifa Fima. He was the station manager for Libyan Arab Airlines at Lucca Airport. Investigators believe that Fima used his position and his airport security pass to help Megrahi get the bomb suitcase onto the Air Malta flight. He was the alleged accomplice, the man on the inside who enabled the plot. The investigation had moved from the macro to the micro, from 845 square miles of wreckage down to a single circuit board fragment, and from there had expanded outwards again, following a trail of evidence across Europe to a small office at a Maltese airport. The case was built, the narrative was clear, the suspects were identified, but the journey to justice was only just beginning. The suspects were in Libya, a nation ruled by the iron fist of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, a pariah state that had no intention of cooperating with the West. The greatest forensic investigation in history had led to a diplomatic brick wall. In November of 1991, nearly 3 years after the bombing, the United States Department of Justice and the Scottish Lord Advocate simultaneously announced indictments against Abdul Basit al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fima for the murder of the 270 victims. The announcement was a landmark moment, the culmination of an investigation that had involved thousands of people and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Warrants were issued for their arrest, but it was a largely symbolic gesture. Both men were safe within the borders of Libya, under the protection of the Gaddafi regime. The United States and the United Kingdom formally demanded that Libya surrender the two suspects for trial. Gaddafi refused. He claimed the accusations were baseless, a product of Western propaganda and anti-Libyan sentiment. He offered to try the men in a Libyan court, an offer that was immediately rejected by the US and UK, who had no faith in the impartiality of Libya's justice system. This refusal triggered one of the great geopolitical standoffs of the late 20th century. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 748, imposing sweeping international sanctions on Libya. All air traffic to and from the country was banned. Arms sales were prohibited. Libyan diplomatic presence abroad was significantly reduced. The goal was to isolate the Gaddafi regime, to cripple its economy, and pressure it into complying with the demands for extradition. The sanctions were tightened further in 1993. For the better part of a decade, Libya became a hermit kingdom, cut off from much of the world. During this long, frustrating period, the families of the victims became a powerful political force. They refused to let the world forget. They formed advocacy groups, like the victims of Pan Am Flight 103, and relentlessly lobbied governments in Washington, London, and at the United Nations. They were a constant moral voice, demanding not vengeance, but justice. They held vigils, wrote letters, and met with world leaders, ensuring that the 270 lives lost were never reduced to a mere diplomatic bargaining chip. Their persistence kept the pressure on Libya when it might have otherwise faded from the international agenda. Behind the scenes, secret and complex negotiations were taking place. Various intermediaries, including at one point President Nelson Mandela of South Africa, tried to broker a deal. Gaddafi was steadfast in his refusal to allow his citizens to be tried in an American or Scottish court. Fearing a biased show trial, the Americans and Scots were equally steadfast that any trial must be held under their legal systems. The impasse seemed permanent. Finally, in the late 1990s, a novel legal and diplomatic solution was crafted. It was a remarkable compromise. The trial would be held under Scottish law, with Scottish prosecutors and Scottish judges. The procedures, rules of evidence, and potential sentences would all be governed by the Scottish legal system. However, the trial would not take place in Scotland. It would be held on neutral ground in the Netherlands. A former United States Air Force base, Camp Zeist near Utrecht, was officially declared sovereign territory of Scotland for the duration of the legal proceedings. This clever arrangement satisfied Scotland's demand for legal jurisdiction and Gaddafi's demand for a neutral venue. In April 1999, after years of sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Libya finally handed over Abdul Basit al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fhimah. They were flown to the Netherlands and placed in custody. The long-awaited trial could finally begin. The Pan Am Flight 103 bombing trial, officially Her Majesty's Advocate versus Megrahi and Fhimah, commenced on May 3, 2000. It was a unique event in legal history. The courtroom at Camp Zeist was purpose-built, with high-tech security and facilities to accommodate hundreds of lawyers, journalists, and observers, including the families of the victims who had waited so long for this day. In accordance with Scottish law, for such a serious crime, the case was heard not by a jury, but by a panel of 3 senior Scottish judges. The prosecution, led by the Lord Advocate Colin Boyd, presented a case built on a long and intricate chain of circumstantial evidence. They argued that there was no single piece of evidence that, on its own, proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, they contended that when woven together, the various strands of evidence formed an undeniable rope that led directly to the 2 accused men. They painstakingly walked the court through the entire investigation. They presented the forensic evidence from the crash site, detailing the discovery of the Semtex and the reconstruction of the aircraft. The court heard from the experts at RARDE about the thumbnail-sized fragment of the MST-13 timer. They heard from Edwin Bollier of Mebo AG, who confirmed his company's dealings with Libya. They then presented the Maltese connection. The judges were shown the charred remnants of the clothing from Mary's house. And then came the star witness, Tony Gossi. He testified for several days, recounting his memory of the man who bought the clothes. When asked in court to identify the man, he looked at McGrahy and said, "He is the man on this side. He is like him very much." It was not a definitive identification, but it was a powerful moment. The prosecution's case was a marvel of investigative diligence, a mosaic of thousands of details assembled over a decade. They connected the timer to Libya, the clothes to Malta, and the man in the Maltese shop to McGrahy. They presented evidence placing FEMA at the airport, arguing he was the essential accomplice who ensured the bomb suitcase made its way onto the flight. The defense teams, in response, systematically attacked every single link in that circumstantial chain. They argued that the entire case was flawed and that the two men were scapegoats, sacrificed by Libya to end the crippling UN sanctions. They aggressively cross-examined Tony Gossi, highlighting the inconsistencies in his statements over the years and emphasizing the multi-million-dollar reward he stood to gain. They suggested he had been coached by investigators and that his memory was unreliable. Was it possible he had confused the date or the man's appearance? They raised the very real possibility of mistaken identity. The defense also presented a powerful challenge to the timer evidence. They produced documents suggesting that other terrorist groups, particularly the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, PFLPGC, also had access to similar timers. They cast doubt on Edwin Bollier's testimony, painting him as an untrustworthy merchant of death. They argued that the initial focus of the investigation had been on a Syrian-backed Palestinian group, and that the switch to Libya was politically motivated, coinciding with shifting alliances in the Middle East following the First Gulf War. Regarding FEMA, his defense argued there was simply no credible evidence linking him to the crime. His presence at the airport was part of his job. The prosecution had no witnesses and no forensic evidence to prove he had handled the bomb suitcase or was part of any conspiracy. The case against him, they argued, was pure speculation. The trial lasted for 84 days. The court heard testimony from 235 witnesses. The judges then retired to consider a mountain of evidence and nearly a year of legal arguments. The world, and especially the families of the victims, held its breath. On January 31, 2001, the three judges delivered their verdict. The chamber was silent as the presiding judge, Lord Sutherland, began to read the lengthy judgment. They found unanimously that the case against Lamin Khalifa FEMA had not been proven. The evidence was insufficient to convict him of murder. He was acquitted and free to go. A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. Then Lord Sutherland turned to the case against the first accused, Abdul Basit al-Megrahi. The judges, he stated, were satisfied that the bomb had been in a suitcase that originated in Malta. They were satisfied that the suitcase contained the clothes purchased from Tony Gossi, and critically, they were satisfied that the purchaser of those clothes was Abdul Basit al-Megrahi. They found Gossi to be a credible witness, despite the inconsistencies, and believed his identification was reliable. Based on this chain of evidence, they found Megrahi guilty of 270 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, which was later increased to 27. The long, arduous investigation had finally secured a conviction. The verdict brought a complex and mixed reaction. For many of the victims' families, it was a moment of profound relief and vindication. Justice, however partial, had been served. A name and a face had been put to their grief. But for others, The acquittal of FEMA and the reliance on a single, flawed witness left a lingering sense of unease. Was McGrahy truly the mastermind, or was he just a cog in a much larger machine? The verdict seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. McGrahy was transferred to a prison in Scotland to begin his sentence. He maintained his innocence, and his legal team immediately began working on an appeal. The legal battles were far from over. His first appeal, in 2002, was rejected. But his lawyers continued to uncover new information that they claimed cast doubt on the safety of the conviction. They questioned the timeline of the clothing purchase and raised new forensic questions about the timer fragment, suggesting it might not have been from the batch sold to Libya. In 2003, in a stunning diplomatic maneuver, the Gaddafi regime formally accepted responsibility for the actions of its officials in the Pan Am 103 bombing. It never admitted guilt, but it accepted civil liability. Libya agreed to pay approximately $2.7 billion in compensation to the families of the victims, about $10 million per family. This act, while stopping short of a full confession, was enough to trigger the lifting of the long-standing UN sanctions. For Gaddafi, it was the price of rejoining the international community. For the families, it was a formal acknowledgement of state-sponsored terror, though it offered little emotional closure. The final and perhaps most controversial chapter of Abdul Basit al-Megrahi's story began in 2009. He had been diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. Under a Scottish legal provision for compassionate release, prisoners with a prognosis of 3 months or less to live can be freed to die at home. In August of 2009, the Scottish Justice Secretary, Kenny MacAskill, announced that he was granting McGrahy's application for compassionate release. The decision ignited a firestorm of international condemnation, particularly from the United States. Many of the American victims' families felt betrayed, seeing it as a politically and economically motivated decision to appease Libya. McGrahy, looking frail and ill, was flown back to Tripoli, where he received a hero's welcome, an image that was deeply painful for the families of his victims. He would go on to live for nearly 3 more years, dying in May 2012, protesting his innocence to the end. His release and the circumstances surrounding it have left a permanent scar on the legacy of the case, a bitter epilogue to a decades-long search for justice. For years, the story seemed to have ended there, with one man convicted but freed, another acquitted, and a host of unanswered questions. But the Lockerbie investigation never truly closed. In the aftermath of the 2011 Libyan civil war and the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, new avenues of inquiry opened up. Investigators were able to access documents and interview former members of the regime who had previously been unreachable. This new evidence led them to a third man, a shadowy figure long suspected of being the bomb maker. His name was Abu Aguila Muhammad Masad Khair al-Marimi. He was a senior Libyan intelligence operative and an explosives expert. In December 2020, the United States Department of Justice unsealed criminal charges against Masad, alleging that he built the device that destroyed Pan Am 103. After being captured by a Libyan militia, he was handed over to American authorities in a clandestine operation in late 2022. More than 3 decades after the bombing, another suspect was finally in custody, awaiting trial in a U.S. court. The case, it turned out, was not a closed chapter of history, but a living, breathing pursuit of accountability. The story of Pan Am Flight 103 is one of almost unimaginable loss, a wound inflicted on hundreds of families and a scar on the collective memory of a small Scottish town. But the ultimate anatomy of this case is one of tenacity. It is found in the quiet determination of the forensic scientists at RAF Longtown, who, faced with millions of pieces of metal, refused to stop until they had rebuilt a ghost aircraft to find its fatal flaw. It is found in the methodical grit of the detectives who followed a microscopic circuit board fragment and the memory of a raincoat to a specific shop on a Mediterranean island. It is the anatomy of a legal system that stretched its own definitions, creating a sovereign court on foreign soil to uphold its principles of justice. But most of all, it is the anatomy of the human spirit, embodied by the families of the 270 victims. For more than 3 decades, they have fought, they have mourned, they have advocated, and they have remembered. They have refused to allow their loved ones to become a footnote in a geopolitical conflict. Their relentless pursuit of the truth has ensured that the echoes of that December night in 1988 have never been allowed to fade into silence. The search for justice in the skies over Lockerbie has no statute of limitations, and the full story may not yet be written. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.